Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was upon a chill and cheerless morning in late October that I found myself once more seated opposite my singular companion at 221B Baker Street. A grey haze had settled over London, muffling the clamour of hansom cabs and casting a leaden pallor upon the city's rooftops. The hearth glowed faintly, and Holmes, in one of his more introspective moods, had taken up his Stradivarius, which he now played with a slow, almost mournful touch. The melody, as aimless as it was haunting, wound itself about the corners of the room like a fog of its own. I had learnt in time to regard such intervals of abstraction not as idleness, but as the sharpening of an intellect that, when called into action, could unravel the most tangled skein of human affairs with frightening clarity. I refrained from interrupting his reverie, content to lose myself in a medical journal and the low crackle of the fire. It was in that tranquil silence that the doorbell rang, followed by the familiar tread of Mrs. Hudson's steps ascending the staircase. A moment later, she tapped discreetly and announced, "A gentleman, sir." Scottish, by the sound of him, says it's urgent. Holmes laid down his bow with the quiet deliberation of a man who had, perhaps, been expecting this very summons. The man who entered was tall, spare, and impeccably dressed, though his fine garments did little to mask the tremor in his limbs, or the pallor of his face. His eyes darted about the room before settling upon Holmes with a kind of desperate hope, as though beholding a lifeline tossed to a drowning man. "My name is Lord Alistair Braemar," he said, his voice low and clipped, the burr of the Highlands barely softened by years of courtly decorum. "I have come to you, Mr. Holmes, because I am not a man easily frightened, and yet I am afraid." Holmes gestured for him to sit, studying him with that curious stillness that often preceded some lightning flash of deduction. "Pray continue, Lord Braemar." "I represent a certain circle of gentlemen," our visitor began, "not in any official capacity. Indeed, the group has long since dissolved, but our history binds us still. We called ourselves the Sean Society, 8 men, all of Edinburgh, bound by common youth and certain shared experiences." I noted how his voice faltered on those last words. "In the last 3 months," he continued, 7 of those men, friends, acquaintances, have either died or disappeared. Each incident was ruled accidental by the authorities, but I cannot ignore the pattern, Mr. Holmes, nor can I dismiss the feeling that I am to be the 8th. Holmes steepled his fingers. "An ominous symmetry," he murmured. "7 gone, 1 remains." Lord Braemar nodded grimly. "And now I fear that whatever has come for them comes for me next." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "You said this Sean Society no longer exists, yet its members are being picked off. That suggests a connection not yet severed." Lord Braemar's jaw tightened. "It was a private club, not political, not criminal, but exclusive. We met during our university years. Later we reconvened occasionally at a private hall near the Royal Mile. The club had certain rituals, symbolic mostly, a gentleman's diversion." "Yet now 7 members are dead," I interjected, "and all in the space of 3 months." "Precisely," said Braemar. 2 were found drowned in the water of Leith. 1 perished in a fire. Another disappeared while travelling to Inverness. No trace has been found. The remaining three, well, each met some different and equally inexplicable fate. The police found no evidence of foul play. Holmes's eyes narrowed. No signs of struggle, no threats delivered, no demands. Braemar hesitated, and I caught the brief flicker of fear that crossed his face. No demands, he said, but one sign, one symbol, which I've brought with me. He withdrew a folded letter from the inner pocket of his coat and laid it gently upon Holmes's table. Holmes unfolded the letter with delicate precision. Inside, upon plain parchment, was a single emblem, rendered in what appeared to be scorched ink, an Ouroboros, a serpent devouring its own tail. Beneath it, the number 8 was penned in a hand so fine it might have been etched with a surgical instrument. "A curious insignia," Holmes murmured. "And you received this how?" "It was left at my estate in the Highlands," said Braemar. "No envelope, no footprint in the gravel. The servants found it upon the front steps at dawn. No one had heard a sound." Holmes turned the paper to the light. The serpent devouring itself. An ancient symbol of cycles, endings and beginnings, often associated with secret orders or hermetic traditions. "I interpreted it differently," Braemar said quietly. "I believe it means I am the last, the final piece in whatever vengeance or curse has taken the others." Holmes's fingers drummed once on the edge of the table. "If so," he said, "then the question is not merely who sent this, but what sin binds you all together, and why it has chosen this moment to surface." Holmes placed the letter aside. "You mentioned 8 members. Can you name them?" Braemar hesitated. "I can recall 6 besides myself. The 7th, we knew him only by a pseudonym. Part of the original agreement, he joined during our travels. We never knew his real name." "A society of secrets," Holmes mused. "Fascinating." "The Cian Society was more than a club," Braemar admitted. "It was a brotherhood, though one grown distant over the years. We kept no formal ledgers, no photographs, no minutes. It was part of our charm, exclusivity through anonymity." "And danger," Holmes replied. "You now find yourselves stalked by someone who knows your past better than you do. Perhaps even better than your fellow members." I glanced at Lord Braemar, whose composure was now visibly fraying. "What would you have me do, Mr. Holmes?" he asked. Holmes stood, crossed to the window, and peered out into the dull grey mist of Baker Street. "I would have you return to Edinburgh," he said, "and wait for my arrival. For if the serpent has marked you, Lord Braemar, then I believe we must follow its coil to its ancient head." It was 2 days hence that Holmes and I departed from King's Cross, bound for Edinburgh by the afternoon express. The autumnal gloom, which had lingered over London like a half-remembered dream, seemed to follow our carriage northward, deepening with every passing mile. Holmes was uncommonly silent throughout the journey, his chin buried in his scarf, and his gaze fixed out the window, as though attempting to trace the serpent's tail across the misted countryside. As for myself, I confess a certain unease had settled upon me since Lord Braemar's visit. Though we had encountered stranger omens than an anonymous letter and a cryptic symbol, there was something singularly disquieting about the precise sequence of deaths and the shadowy nature of the society at their centre. It is one thing to face danger in the open light of day. It is quite another to sense it closing in from the recesses of one's own past. "You believe the danger real, then?" I asked Holmes at one point. He did not turn his head, but spoke softly. "There is nothing so perilous as a circle closed upon itself, Watson, especially when its members cannot even name one another. We arrived in Edinburgh just past dusk, the lamps of Waverley Station glowing dimly through the encroaching fog. Edinburgh presented itself to us as a city steeped in shadow and stone, its ancient closes and narrow wynds exhaling a history far older and, I suspected, far darker than the polished avenues of London. The very air seemed thick with the whispers of secrets long buried beneath cobbled streets. We took lodging in a modest inn off the Royal Mile, a place recommended by Lord Braemar himself, whose instructions had been sent ahead in a brief and formal telegram. Holmes, as was his habit, set about arranging our affairs with brisk efficiency, and within the hour we had secured rooms that afforded both discretion and proximity to the older quarter of the city. I could not help but observe the change in Holmes. While in London he had appeared reflective, almost passive, here he became as taut and alert as a bloodhound on the scent. He moved with a quiet purpose, scanning the architecture and alleyways as though expecting the very stones to confess. "We are not merely in pursuit of a killer, Watson," he remarked that evening as we walked the narrow spine of the High Street. "We are in pursuit of a memory, a buried truth. And in a city as old as this, truth is a thing often entombed in silence." It was then that I understood. This was not merely a crime to be solved. It was a history to be unearthed. Over the next 2 days, Holmes pursued the surviving kin of the deceased members of the Science Society with his usual unobtrusive elegance. It was remarkable how, without ever declaring his true purpose, he succeeded in drawing out intimate recollections from even the most reticent of widows and sons. Our first visit was to the home of Mr. Gilbert Langley, one of the drowned. His widow, a pale and precise woman of 40, spoke of how her husband had become withdrawn in the weeks preceding his death, haunted by dreams of sand and fire, and obsessed with reading through a collection of dusty journals from his university days. Another widow, Lady Duncairn, mentioned her late husband's morbid fascination with a box of relics he had kept locked in a desk drawer, which vanished following his death. In each household, Holmes asked only the gentlest of questions. Did he ever mention North Africa? Or was he in contact with men named Braemar or Morven? And in every instance, the response was the same. Yes, they had all taken part in some distant expedition, though the nature of it was never fully disclosed. North Africa, Holmes repeated to me that evening as we sat before a modest fire in our rented sitting room. A land of many graves and more secrets. An archaeological mission, I ventured. Possibly, but there is something darker in it, Watson. The presence of that serpent symbol suggests a belief system, or at least an obsession, with ancient cycles of justice. One does not burn such a mark onto a page unless one intends to burn it into memory. And with that, he opened his notebook and began sketching the Ouroboros, its coiled body enclosing the fatal number 8. It was on the 3rd morning of our stay that Holmes informed me without preamble that we were to pay a visit to what he referred to as the soul of the society. He had secured, through discreet inquiry and a well-placed gratuity, access to the old hall in which the Sky and Society had once convened, a stone structure nestled in the upper tier of the Cannon Gate, long since abandoned to time and neglect. We arrived by foot, Holmes leading the way with swift, purposeful strides, his eyes alert beneath the brim of his hat. The building, while outwardly unremarkable, bore upon its lintel a faint carving, weathered by wind and age, of a closed eye within a triangle, and below it a faded motto in Latin, Judicium expectamus omnes. We all await judgment. Inside, the air was heavy with disuse, yet there remained evidence of its former function. A dais at the far end, chairs arranged in a half circle, and on the stone walls, peculiar symbols carved with obsessive precision. Holmes moved with caution, studying each mark in silence. Several bore resemblance to esoteric alphabets, Coptic, perhaps, or early Arabic, and there, beneath a soot-darkened arch, was etched again the serpent devouring its tail. "It is not merely a club," Holmes murmured, half to himself. It was a sanctuary for secrets. I shivered despite myself. There was a solemnity to the place, as though every stone had absorbed oaths never meant to be spoken aloud. Holmes knelt beside the hearth, examining its worn bricks with that familiar narrowing of the eyes that always signalled the scent of something hidden. I remained still, sensing that we were on the cusp of uncovering what the dead had failed to bury. Holmes's fingers pressed along the edges of the hearth with a surgeon's delicacy. After a brief pause, there was a click, so soft it might have been imagined, and a thin stone slab slid inward to reveal a hollow behind the fire brick. From within, he withdrew a small leather-bound volume, its cover cracked with age and soot, darkened from long concealment. He opened it slowly, his brows drawing together. Inside were names, dates, and curious annotations written in a ciphered hand. Some entries were accompanied by tiny symbols: a flame, a blade, a chain, and besides 7 of the names, a figure had been carefully added. The number 8, circled in black ink. "This," Holmes said quietly, "is a reckoning." He flipped through the pages, halting at one entry that bore the initials EV and a date some 30 years past, underlined thrice in red ink. Beneath it, the word desertum had been added in Latin script, and to the side, a triangle enclosing the letter X. 8 men, bound by something they did not wish the world to know, Holmes said, and 1 man, possibly presumed dead, who has not forgotten. I leaned closer, the gravity of the discovery pressing upon me like a physical weight. "What does it mean, Holmes?" "It means," he said, closing the ledger gently, "that the serpent does not bite at random. It follows a design." That evening, we took our customary stroll along the Royal Mile, the air damp with a low-lying fog that rolled down from the crags and settled in the narrow closes like some ancient spectre. Holmes, though appearing casual, walked with a pace just short of urgency, his cane tapping lightly on the stone as his gaze flicked toward the shifting shadows. I noted his frequent glances over his shoulder and eventually asked, "You suspect we're being followed?" "I do not suspect, Watson. I am certain." He offered no more, and I, trained over many adventures not to press him prematurely, held my tongue. Yet I could not suppress the sudden chill that ran through me, as though the very mist had ears and eyes of its own. Twice more I turned, and once I thought I glimpsed a figure retreating into a narrow wynd, a tall man, perhaps, clad in a dark overcoat. But when I peered again, there was only the slow swirl of fog and the muted glow of gas lamps. Holmes made no effort to confront our follower. "He is not yet ready," he said calmly as we reached the entrance of our inn. "But he will be. The more I disturb the ashes of this society, the more embers begin to glow." I slept little that night, haunted by the sensation that somewhere in that sleeping city, unseen eyes were fixed upon us, silent, watchful, and waiting. It was upon Holmes's insistence, and through a contact of Lord Braemar's, that we arranged a visit to the residence of Lady Morven, widow to the late Sir Angus Morven, one of the Science Society's more reclusive members, and the 5th to perish in this dark procession. Her name had appeared briefly in the ledger we had unearthed, marked only by the symbol of a broken crown, which Holmes took to indicate that Sir Angus had once held a position of authority within the group. Lady Morven received us in a drawing room whose thick draperies and faded tapestries seemed to echo the solemnity of her bearing. She was a woman of striking poise, yet there was a brittle edge to her voice, and when Holmes inquired after her husband's final days, her composure faltered. "He was not well," she said, "not in body nor in mind. For weeks he would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, whispering about deserts and chains and something he called the judgment." Holmes gave a slight nod, but did not interrupt. "He was afraid of someone," she continued, "or something. He said it was old, older than any man, and that it had come back for them." Watson leaned forward. "Do you know what he meant by that?" Lady Morven looked down at her gloved hands. I believe they did something, years ago. Something they swore never to speak of. My husband never broke that silence, but it broke him." When we took our leave, Holmes remarked with quiet finality, "The sins of the society are beginning to rise, Watson, and the dead, it seems, are not the only ones haunted by them." That same evening, as we returned to our rooms, a folded slip of paper awaited me upon the small writing desk by the hearth. There was no sign of how it had been delivered, no knock, no footsteps upon the stair, and Mrs. Gow, our landlady, swore that no one had been admitted during our absence. Holmes, upon seeing the note, merely gestured for me to open it. The paper was of rough grain, folded twice, and inside was a single line penned in a stark, angular script. "One survives not by brilliance, but by silence." There was no signature, no indication of origin. I read it aloud, and Holmes took the slip delicately between his fingers, holding it up to the light. "No watermark," he said. "Ink consistent with standard trade use. And yet, the phrasing is almost ceremonial. It's not a warning, Watson. It's a creed." "A threat, nonetheless," I said. "Do you suppose it came from the same man who follows us?" "Undoubtedly. Though its delivery was not meant to frighten us, it was meant to remind us that we are treading upon consecrated ground." That night I slept uneasily, and I confess I rose once to check the lock upon our door. For all Holmes's calm demeanour, I could not shake the feeling that we had stirred something ancient and volatile, and that even our presence in this city had become a transgression. And still, Holmes did not speak of leaving. On the contrary, he seemed more resolved than ever. It was the following morning that Holmes requested we visit a small private library belonging to the late Professor Callum Drew, another of the fallen seven, and, according to Holmes, a man with more skeletons than shelves. His widow, a slight and timid woman who had not ventured beyond the property since his death, granted us brief access to his collection with visible reluctance. Holmes worked swiftly, scanning the spines of journals and manuscripts, pulling volumes at random with a surgeon's instinct for incision. At last, from the second row of a dusty case near the window, he extracted a thin, leather-bound folio, innocuous in appearance, but which he opened with unmistakable intent. "Here," he said, pointing to a series of annotations in the margins. "Note this pattern, numbers, initials, and beneath them, Latin phrases." I leaned in to read, "Sanguis pro fidem, desertum, exilium," all written in Drew's tight, slanted hand. "What does it mean?" "It means," Holmes said, "that their expedition to North Africa was not an academic venture. It was an oath, a blood oath." He flipped to the back of the volume, where a single page had been affixed with sealing wax. Carefully, he peeled it loose, revealing a ciphered message beneath. For some moments he stood in total silence, deciphering the symbols. When he had finished, he handed it to me. 8 men entered the fire. Only 7 returned. The one they left behind does not forget. We stared at one another in stunned silence. Then one of them survived, I said. Holmes's eyes narrowed. No, Watson, not just survived. He returned, and now he has begun to count backward. It was just after breakfast on the following morning when a messenger arrived at our lodging, breathless and pale. He brought word from Lord Braemar's estate. His prized stallion, a magnificent Highland breed known across the county for both its pedigree and strength, had been found dead in its paddock, the cause unknown. Holmes did not speak at once, but merely rose, requested his coat, and instructed the boy to take us directly there. Lord Braemar met us at the stables. He was visibly shaken. There was no sign of injury, he said. No wound, no trauma. The beast was in perfect health not a day ago. Holmes approached the carcass with care. He knelt beside the head and examined the lips and nostrils, then the ground around the hooves. After a moment, he rose and turned to us. Belladonna, he said softly. In the water trough, most likely. It causes paralysis of the respiratory tract in horses, swift and silent. Braemar looked at him with disbelief. But why the horse? Why not me? Holmes's gaze darkened. Because this was not an attempt at murder, my lord. It was a message, a symbolic execution. The beast, noble and loyal, represents something, or someone. He paused. You are being spared for now, but the hand behind this grows bolder. We rode back in silence. Holmes remained thoughtful, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. He's drawing closer, Watson, he said at last, but not to Braemar. I turned to him, startled. Then to whom? Holmes gave no reply. But I noted then, for the first time, a strange gravity behind his eyes, as though some private calculation had reached its terrible conclusion. It was near midnight when Holmes spoke the truth aloud. We had returned to our lodgings and were seated by the hearth, the day's revelations pressing heavy upon us. Holmes had been uncharacteristically silent all evening, his gaze lingering on the flickering coals, as though seeking some shape in the flames. There is something I must tell you, Watson, he said at last, his voice low and even. Something I've suspected for some time, but which I now believe to be certain. I leaned forward. What is it? He reached into his satchel and drew forth the ledger we had recovered from the Cian Society's hall. He opened it to the final page and tapped lightly on the figure 8, the same symbol that had appeared beneath each of the victims' names. Braemar believes he is the last, that he is the 8th, but he is not. I stared at him, uncomprehending. What do you mean? Holmes closed the ledger. The true 8th man is me. It was several seconds before I found my voice. Holmes, that is absurd. You were never a part of that society. No, he replied. But to a mind seeking vengeance, my intrusion, my interference, is a betrayal all its own. The serpent cycle was never meant to close with Braemar. It was meant to consume the man capable of unravelling it. I sat back in my chair, chilled. You believe the killer has redirected his final act toward you? I do. The horse was not a warning for Braemar. It was a herald. And the note you received, one survives not by brilliance, but by silence, was not for you. It was for me. There was silence between us then, broken only by the occasional crackle from the hearth. And yet, I said finally, you remain. Holmes gave a thin smile. For the moment, Watson, but I suspect our adversary is very nearly done waiting. It happened the following evening. We had dined modestly and were returning to our lodgings by way of a narrow lane that wound its way along the base of the cannon gate. The fog had descended thick and sudden, shrouding the gas lamps and rendering every figure a spectre. Holmes walked slightly ahead, his steps deliberate, his hand in the pocket of his coat. There was no warning. A dark shape burst from the alley to our right, quick, silent, and purposeful. I saw the gleam of a blade just as Holmes twisted aside, catching the attacker's arm and turning the weapon's arc into the stone wall. The man recovered swiftly, striking again, but Holmes, ever composed, drew his walking stick and drove the silver tip hard into the assailant's ribs. There was a grunt, a stumble, and then the figure vanished into the fog with remarkable speed. By the time I reached Holmes's side, the street was empty. "You're wounded?" I asked breathlessly. Number, he was quick, but not careless. He wanted to test me, not kill me, not yet. I stared into the mist. "Who moves like that?" "A soldier," Holmes answered, "or someone trained by one. He's no amateur, Watson. This is not vengeance from emotion. It is vengeance executed by discipline." He paused. "And that makes him twice as dangerous." Holmes, once resolved, wasted no time. The very morning following the attack in the alleyway, he dispatched 2 discreet missives by special courier, one to Lord Braemar and the other, whose recipient he did not disclose to me, by way of a sealed envelope bearing no return name. "Are you inviting him into the open?" I asked. "Indeed, but not into the open, Watson, into the familiar." The setting for this confrontation was to be the very hall in which the Cian Society had once convened. Holmes secured it once more by arrangement with the local magistrate, who, at Holmes's request, agreed to remain unseen but stationed constables within reach. The pretext, as Holmes explained it, was a memorial, a final honouring of the brotherhood that once was. Lord Braemar accepted the invitation with some reluctance, though he trusted Holmes enough by now to comply without protest. The other guest, whose name Holmes continued to withhold, was told that an accounting of oaths would occur, and that it was best that he be present. "You believe he will come?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "He will not resist the chance to complete the circle. If I understand the rhythm of his vengeance, and I believe I do, he will view this as his moment of triumph, or revelation." I could not deny a growing unease as the hour approached. There was something almost theatrical in Holmes's staging, something too intimate for the usual rigours of law and deduction. "This is not merely an unveiling, is it?" I asked. "You mean to confront him before Braemar himself?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Where better to unmask a spectre, Watson, than in the house it once haunted?" The hall, when we returned that evening, had been prepared with Holmes's usual precision. A circle of high-backed chairs stood in their old formation. Upon the dais, a single lantern cast long shadows across the stone, illuminating the very hearth from which Holmes had retrieved the ledger of secrets. Lord Braemar arrived first, dressed in dark mourning attire and visibly uneasy. Holmes welcomed him with calm civility and motioned him to a seat within the circle. I sat beside him. Holmes took the central position just beside the dais, the ledger placed before him like a judge's gavel. Our final guest arrived precisely at the appointed hour. He was a tall man, well-groomed and composed, bearing the manner of one who had once held command. Holmes greeted him with the same formal tone, and gestured silently for him to take the remaining chair. He did so without comment, though I noted a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or calculation, pass across his face as his eyes met Holmes's. Holmes stood and opened the ledger. "We are gathered," he said, "not merely in memory of the Cian Society, but in acknowledgement of its silence, of what it concealed, and of what it has wrought. The room remained still. I have studied your records. I have spoken with widows, with former associates, and I have walked the steps of your former expedition, if not in body, then in fact. He looked at each man in turn, but lingered longest on the final guest. There was a trial once, he continued, a mock proceeding performed upon initiation. The charges were symbolic: pride, deceit, betrayal, the rituals of justice. Tell me, do either of you recall who played the accused? Neither answered. Holmes did not pause. I do. He reached into his coat and withdrew the ciphered page discovered in Professor Drew's folio. It speaks of fire, of betrayal, of one man left behind. He allowed the silence to settle once more, then said clearly, Colonel Erasmus Vale. At that, the man in question shifted, just slightly, but in that movement I sensed the truth had been struck like a bell. Holmes stepped forward and opened the ledger once more, turning to a page he had marked in advance. There is an entry here, he said, one which I found curious. It records an oath, but beside it is a symbol not present elsewhere, a triangle enclosing the Roman numeral X. I thought little of it until I recalled that such marks were often used by field medics in desert campaigns to denote a prisoner wounded during capture. His gaze shifted to Vale, who sat stone still, his hands clasped on his knee. I did not understand its significance until I examined the page's edge, Holmes continued. In the corner, in nearly invisible ink, someone had added a note. X equals scar, left palm. At this, Holmes turned directly toward Colonel Vale. I imagine the injury was incurred when your convoy was attacked. A blade, perhaps, in the chaos of your so-called disappearance. Vale did not answer. Holmes took a step closer. I ask because it is still visible. You concealed it well, Colonel, but not well enough. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a letter opener, polished to a mirror shine. He held it before Vale, not as a weapon, but as a reflective surface. For the briefest moment, as the man raised his hand to brush it away, the faint line across his left palm caught the light. A mark, a scar, and in that instant, Holmes knew, and so did I. The room was silent, but charged. Holmes spoke quietly, almost gently. You were left for dead in the desert, and you survived. You returned not for justice, but for sentence. You judged them, and now you would judge us. Vale's voice, when it came, was low and bitter. And who better to carry it out? Colonel Erasmus Vale, once presumed dead and buried beneath Saharan sand, rose now before us not as a ghost, but as a man weathered by fury and scorched by betrayal. The scar on his hand, faint but damning, was merely the first in a ledger of wounds carved into flesh and soul alike. He did not deny it. Indeed, he scarcely seemed surprised to have been unmasked. I see, he said, his voice rough as gravel, that not even death can best a man like you, Mr. Holmes. Holmes gave no reply. He did not need to. I was left, Vale continued, in a prison dug into the earth. We had gone seeking ruins, some sacred site near the Algerian border. The society funded it quietly, and 8 of us crossed the sands. But when it turned to ruin, when the local tribes rose against us, they fled. They bribed their way out and left me with the dead and dying. He turned now toward Lord Braemar, who sat motionless. You were there, Vale spat. You knew, you voted. They said it was expedient, necessary, that I could not be extracted without risking the whole mission. But the truth was simpler. They thought I wouldn't survive, that I would disappear like the desert wind. He stepped forward slowly, and though Holmes did not move, I felt my own hand tighten around the handle of my cane. "I did survive," Vale said. "4 years in that hell, forgotten by the world, until I found my way out, changed my name, and returned. I watched them build their lives, their legacies, as if nothing had happened, as if they had not consigned me to death." Holmes's voice cut through the air at last, soft but unyielding. "You chose vengeance over justice." "I chose remembrance," Vale hissed. "If they would not confess what they had done, then I would etch the memory into their bones." Holmes nodded slowly. "And so, you fashioned your revenge in their own language, the symbols, the rituals." Vale's eyes narrowed, and for the first time there was something like pride behind them. "Everything they revered," he said, "I turned against them. The society worshipped secrets, so I became their deepest one. They feared ancient punishment. I gave it to them. Fire, poison, water, entombment. The same judgments they mimicked in jest, I delivered in earnest." He began to pace, hands clasped behind his back. "They mocked the idea of trial, of sentence. But I remembered. I remembered every vote, every oath, every man who turned his face from mine as I begged not to be left." Lord Braemar, pale as ash, did not speak. He stared straight ahead, as Vale's voice filled the hall like smoke. "I allowed each man the illusion of safety. I waited years, decades, until they forgot me entirely. Then I counted them down. And when only one remained," Holmes asked, "I sent the mark, the serpent, a symbol they all knew, 8 turns of the circle, and no way out." Holmes tilted his head. "And yet you did not account for one variable." Vale's mouth curled. "You." "Precisely," Holmes replied. Holmes turned toward the doorway and spoke just 3 words. "Take him, Inspector." At once, 2 plainclothes officers emerged from behind the heavy drapery near the rear of the hall. Colonel Vale stiffened, but he did not resist. He merely cast a long, final glance at Holmes, one soldier to another. "I should have known it would be you," he muttered. As the officers secured him and led him away, Holmes returned to the centre of the room and closed the ledger with deliberate calm. "You wondered," he said to Lord Braemar, "how I knew. It was the cipher, of course, but also the precision. Each death mimicked a punishment mentioned in a society document, annotated in Vale's hand. The scar proved his identity. But it was the arrogance of the pattern that gave him away. Only someone intimately tied to the society's innermost rites could have executed it with such fidelity." He looked down at the sealed ledger. "Revenge," he said, "does not forget. But it does, in time, become predictable." And with that, he turned toward me. "Come, Watson. The train awaits." We returned that night to our lodgings in Edinburgh, the rain whispering steadily against the window panes and the last remnants of smoke curling upward from the hearth. Holmes, having removed his coat and gloves, sat with his steepled fingers before him, his eyes fixed upon the serpentine figure inked upon the letter that had first drawn Lord Braemar to our door. "The symbol," he began after a long pause, "was not chosen for its mystique alone, Watson. It carries weight, ritual weight. The serpent devouring its own tail is known in Hermetic philosophy as the Ouroboros, the eternal cycle, self-consuming and self-renewing. It appears in Egyptian, Greek, and alchemical traditions. But to the Skyan society, it held a specific and personal resonance." I leaned forward as Holmes continued, his tone measured and contemplative. "The society, as you've seen, steeped itself in arcane literature, hermetic treatises, Rosicrucian manifestos, obscure rites drawn from desert mystery cults. They fancy themselves as learned initiates, guardians of esoteric truth. But as is often the case with secret societies, it was less about enlightenment than about exclusivity and power. He turned the letter over. The symbol Vale used, serpent and number 8, was a perversion of the society's emblem of unity. He transformed it into a seal of judgment. In their rituals, the Ouroboros marked the threshold of initiation. But in Vale's hands, it became a death sentence. A stamp of closure that the cycle was to end with the one marked. I stared at the page in silence, the ink still dark and distinct against the yellowed paper. Did they understand what it meant, Holmes? Braemar did, he replied. His fear was real, not because he understood the deeper meaning of the mark, but because he recognized that someone else did. He stood and poured himself a small measure of whiskey, then added with quiet finality, "When a man takes up the language of his betrayers, Watson, he does not do so idly." Vale knew their code, and he twisted it with deliberate precision. Holmes drew a thin sheet of paper from his notebook and laid it across the table. On it, he had written a list of names, those 7 unfortunate souls who had died in succession. Beside each, a date, and beside the dates, a series of notations that only Holmes could have constructed with such exactitude. "You will observe," he said, tapping the page, "that the order of death was not random. It followed a sequence, one not known to the public, but retrievable through analysis of the coded entries in the ledger." I read through them carefully. "These are the voting records." "Precisely," said Holmes. "When the decision was made to abandon Vale in the desert, each member cast a vote. The matter was not unanimous. Vale noted the names and the strength of their protests. Those who spoke against leaving him, though they acquiesced in the end, were marked with symbols of lesser condemnation. The most vocal proponents of his abandonment were marked differently, by severity, by betrayal. He pointed to the first 3 names on the list. These died most violently: fire, drowning, poison. The 4th and 5th were slower, more symbolic. The 6th, Sir Angus Morven, was mentally shattered, perhaps from guilt alone. And the 7th was chosen not for severity of guilt, but proximity to the final piece. Braemar. "Why not Braemar himself?" I asked. "Because," Holmes replied, "Braemar was the bait. Vale meant for the circle to close upon him, but only with the proper witness present. The last act, Braemar's murder, was meant to be observed by the one man who might understand its logic. And that was you." Holmes inclined his head. "The 8th name, Watson, was never meant to belong to a member. It was meant for an equal, an intellect capable of following the thread to its source. Vale saw his vengeance not merely as justice but as artistry. And like all artists, he wanted an audience worthy of the work." He leaned back and exhaled. "And so I was invited, not to prevent the final death, but to witness it, to complete the cycle." There was a long silence as I digested Holmes's words. The notion that he had been drawn into the circle not by accident, but by deliberate design, struck me with chilling clarity. "Then he never intended to kill you out of anger," I said slowly. "He saw you as the only one fit to carry his memory forward." Holmes gave a faint nod. "He viewed me not as an adversary, but as a mirror. The 8th man was always symbolic, the one who would understand, if not condone, what he had done. And had you not uncovered his identity? Then I might have died in Braemar's stead, or not at all. It depended on how much recognition Vale required. It is one of the rare cases, Watson, in which the killer desired comprehension more than blood. My presence affirmed the success of his sequence, until I disrupted it." He rose and paced the room, his hands clasped behind him. The pattern of deaths was constructed not only to evoke retribution, but to stimulate deduction. Each symbol, each method of execution, each location, it was a message, one composed in the dead languages of ancient justice and delivered to a singular recipient. He turned toward me. Vale did not fear the law. He did not fear Braemar. He feared obscurity. He feared that his vengeance, so meticulously planned, would pass unrecognized. But I was there, and I saw. I shook my head in quiet disbelief. To think a man would kill for the sake of acknowledgement. Not merely acknowledgement, Holmes said. Reckoning. In his mind, he was the only one who remembered the truth, the only one who had suffered for it. And so he chose to end the tale on his own terms, leaving behind no witnesses but one. He glanced toward the dying embers in the hearth. I was never his enemy, Watson. I was his epilogue. As Holmes concluded his explanation and the fire dwindled into a bed of smouldering coals, I found myself gripped not only by the intricacy of the case, but by a profound sense of unease that clung to me more stubbornly than the Scottish fog. In all our cases, of murderers and blackmailers, of stolen fortunes and counterfeiters, there lingered a thread of human fallibility, a flaw drawn into the light of reason. Yet here, in Edinburgh, amidst the carved stones and ancient rites of what was once a gentleman's society, I had seen something different. This was not vice born of desperation or malice ignited by passion. It was cruelty wrapped in civility, horror hidden behind heraldry. These men, esteemed, refined, cloaked in lineage and learning, had left one of their own to perish in the dust for the sake of expediency. Their betrayal had not been the act of common rogues, but of educated, influential men who thought their secret choices immune from consequence. I thought of the widows, of the shattered dreams and quiet madness that had followed these deaths, and I could not help but wonder how many other crimes slumbered beneath polished shoes and silk waistcoats, forgotten by time, but not by those who bore their cost. Holmes sat across from me, silent, his fingers interlaced. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction in the closing of this circle, only the cool, unrelenting clarity of justice seen through a prism few dared to hold. Evil, I murmured, is not always wild and raving, Holmes. Sometimes it wears a crest and speaks Latin, to which he replied without lifting his eyes, "That, my dear Watson, is why it is so rarely seen." Later that evening, over a quiet supper, I pressed Holmes on a matter which had gnawed at the edge of my thoughts. "When did you suspect it was Vale?" He dabbed at his mouth with a napkin and spoke without hesitation. "From the moment I read the name desertum in the ciphered ledger." It was a curious term, Latin for abandoned or wilderness, and its placement alongside the triangle symbol and the mark of judgment was too deliberate to ignore. But surely many men were lost during colonial expeditions, I said. "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied, "but few were lost with such symbolic resonance, and fewer still left such a meticulous trail behind them. Vale, even in vengeance, could not abandon the order he had once revered. His punishments followed the society's own imaginary code, each victim sentenced according to their place in the betrayal." He leaned back, thoughtful. "Weeks ago, I came across a fragment of a military report, torn from a correspondence archive in Cairo. It referenced a British officer presumed dead after a failed excavation mission near the Algerian border who had resurfaced in Tangier under a false name. The handwriting was altered, the name expunged, but the dates matched. The survivor, I believed, was Vale. You never told me." "I needed him to reveal himself," Holmes said simply. Had I acted too soon, he might have fled, and his justice would remain unfinished. But if I allowed the pattern to continue, up to a point, he would believe himself unseen. It was a risk to your own life. He gave a slight shrug. The circle was his trap. I merely stepped into it with my eyes open. He paused, then added with rare softness, "Had I not, Watson, I believe others would have paid the price for my restraint." The following morning, a dense mist still clung to the spires and alleys of Edinburgh as we boarded the early train south. Holmes was in a contemplative mood, seated by the window with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze distant and unreadable. We sat in silence for some time. I watched the landscape unfurl beyond the glass, moorland and crag, heather and stone, until I could no longer bear the weight of my thoughts unspoken. "Holmes," I said, "have you ever considered joining such a society? Not one of arcane rites and blood oaths, perhaps, but a fellowship of minds, scholars, philosophers, scientists." He turned his head slightly, and a trace of a smile passed his lips. "You mean a brotherhood of intellects?" "Yes. You would be revered, respected, protected." Holmes chuckled lightly. "And confined, Watson." I frowned. "Surely not all such societies are corrupt." "Perhaps not," he said. "But they are all bound by one principle, loyalty to the group above the truth. To maintain order, they demand silence. To preserve unity, they bury dissent. And to ensure continuity, they sacrifice clarity." He looked out at the passing hills. "I have never sought protection, Watson, nor reverence. My work thrives on clarity, on the precise dissection of truth from noise, and no oath, no creed, no ancient rite can stand between me and a fact once uncovered." I said nothing. I knew better than to interrupt when Holmes entered such rare introspective territory. After a time he turned back to me, his expression still and firm. "Because, Watson," he said, "the only oath I have ever sworn is to the truth, and the truth has no brotherhood." There was a stillness in the carriage then, broken only by the soft rhythm of wheels on the rail. I turned away, gazing once more at the passing countryside, the weight of his words settling deep into my thoughts. And so ended the matter of the 8 men of Edinburgh, a tale not merely of murder, but of memory, and the ruin it leaves when buried too long in silence. As the train rattled southward, and the last haze of Edinburgh disappeared behind us, I turned once more to Holmes, who remained contemplative, his eyes half-lidded, his hands resting gently on the cane that had so recently deflected a blade in the mist. "You've uncovered vengeance, betrayal, and the ruins of honour," I said quietly. "But do you think Vale ever truly believed he was right?" Holmes did not respond immediately. He gazed out at the rolling countryside, then said in a tone almost too calm for the weight it carried, "Men like Vale do not seek rightness, Watson. They seek remembrance. When the world forgets their suffering, they become archivists of their own pain, scribing it in blood until someone takes note." He turned to face me, his expression sharp with something between sorrow and scorn. "But vengeance, however precise, is never justice. Justice restores the balance. Vengeance only rewrites the story, and always in the wrong ink." And so, dear reader, the circle was closed. Yet one question lingers in the silent chamber of thought. What do you think was Colonel Vale's greatest mistake? Was it trusting his intellect above all, leaving one witness too many, or choosing symbolism over silence? Let us know what you believe truly unravelled his perfect plan. If you enjoy this tale of secrets, symbols, and Sherlock's relentless pursuit of truth, Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe for more mysterious adventures from the world of Sherlock Holmes. And if you know someone who enjoys a good puzzle in the shadows, share this story with them. After all, as Holmes once said, there is nothing more deceptive than an obvious clue. Until next time.